Hey there, everyone. This is Gregg Schutze for ReadyForTheDraft.com, and this is the Ready for the Draft podcast, episode 14 of the series dedicated to the draft-eligible prospect for the 2020 NFL Draft, which is set to begin in April in Las Vegas, Nevada. Now, week 12 of the college football season is in the books. I can't believe we're already almost through the entire month of November. Pretty soon we're going to be talking about the bowl season right around the corner. Again, hard to believe. We got Thanksgiving coming up next week, and things are really starting to shape up for the college football playoff. LSU, Ohio State, Clemson, and Georgia all maintain the top 4 spots, followed by Alabama. And of course, week 12 is a week that I think Alabama fans really want to forget more than anything else. And yes, they did beat Mississippi State 38-7, but they lose Tua Tagovailoa for the season with dislocated hip and a fracture to the posterior wall. The good news is the surgery was a success, and he's supposed to make a full recovery. I think when he went down and everyone was talking about it being a hip, the first thought that came to mind was Bo Jackson's career-ending hip injury, and ultimately had to have that hip replaced. And I think that's something that's really scary, especially for someone with of Tua's age. But you look at it, and Tua, prognosis-wise, if everything shakes out and he ends up healing and the hip checks out, obviously the medicals still are going to be the biggest concern for Tua. I think Tua was going to be the number one quarterback, although Joe Burrow and Justin Herbert really tightening that gap there. But Tua, still, you have the ankle injuries, high ankle sprains on both of those, and then now the hip. The biggest thing with Tua is that's when he's been extending plays. All of those have happened when he's trying to extend plays and really get outside the pocket. I think with these injuries now, Tua's going to have to try to manipulate the pocket without getting really out on the edges. And that's really going to be kind of how he's going to have to tweak his game going to the next level. He's so precise, so accurate. The anticipation, the ball placement, his ability to throw his receivers open and allow his receivers, Jerry Jeudy, Devontae Smith, Henry Ruggs, all of whom have a great chance to be first-round picks, to make plays after the catch. And that's really what you're looking for. And at the NFL level, Kyler Murray's already said, hey, look, the windows are there, the gaps are there when I run, but they fill up so quickly. And the same thing with the gaps, like I was saying, the windows when he's throwing the football. Tua, with that anticipation and his ability to throw his receivers open, I think that's one of the things for him that he really has going in his favor. He's just going to have to watch things from a mobility standpoint, because 2 high ankle sprains back-to-back years plus the hip, red flags galore when you're talking about durability. And that's one of the big concerns that you have to have. Is Tua still a first-round pick? I think that he is. As long as the hip checks out, as long as the medicals check out, I think he's still a first-round pick. We saw that the Tennessee Titans took a chance on Jeffrey Simmons after he tore his knee and sat out for the majority of the season. But he was able to step in and was able to dominate, really, from the time that he stepped foot on an NFL field. And the chance, the opportunity there, bringing him in, they took a risk. And the risk paid off. So I think there's going to be teams that, and it may actually be to Tua's benefit, he's going to be going more than likely to a team that may already have an established offensive line, some established weapons, not a team that's looking to rebuild. So it may actually benefit Tua in the long run, going to if his draft stock falls a little bit, if he's in the teens or the 20s, I don't see him falling out of the first round unless the hip, really there are question marks there. We saw what happened with Miles Jack when he tore his knee, and there were concerns about it being a potential arthritic knee and what's going to happen there. So he fell all the way to the 5th pick of the second round. And then Jalen Smith, obviously with his knee tear in the bowl game, he fell to the second round as well. So is there a chance Tua could fall to round number 2? I think there is, but there are enough teams that are looking for a quarterback, whether it's as a starter or someone to be a backup, I think there are enough teams that are going to be out there that Tua is going to get a look in round number 1. So that wasn't the only game that we ran into in week 12. I think it was a real, a statement game for Clemson against Wake Forest, 52-3. Dominating performance by the Clemson Tigers. And I think it's a team that defending national champs, and they're not really getting the respect that I think they deserve. T. Higgins, 4 receptions, 64 yards, 3 touchdowns. Just a guy who just attacks the football in the air, does a really good job winning at the line of scrimmage with his routes, does a good job setting up his man. A lot of times, you'd see him on a slant or a post, and a quick head fake to the outside before cutting, crossing the face of the defender and cutting back inside. T. Higgins, to me, is just really showing himself as a first round pick at the wide receiver position. But then Travis Etienne, when you look at the stats, here he is, over 100 yards again and a touchdown, 3 receptions, 37 yards. But you watch the way that he runs; he's running with power. He was one of those guys, hey, he's a speed demon. He's going to be a guy that's going to take the top off of defense, just, a home run threat. But he's running through contact. He's running over guys. He's stepping out of tackles. And you really want to see that from a guy like Travis Etienne, a guy who could be a fringe first rounder, early second round. These running backs are really trying to separate themselves. You have Jonathan Taylor. You have the speed of Chuba Hubbard. You have J.K. Dobbins. You have DeAndre Swift, and obviously Travis Etienne. And I think, what Travis Etienne is trying to do is he's trying to show that power that some of these backs just don't have, to go along with the speed that he definitely has more than any of these other backs. So it's going to be interesting to see where Travis Etienne falls, especially when we get into pre-draft workouts and such. I think one of the other games that you have to talk about is OU. OU without CeeDee Lamb taking on Baylor, previously undefeated Baylor, down 28-3, and Jalen Hurts ends up rallying, leading his team to victory 38-34. Jalen Hurts, 30 of 42, 297 yards, 4 touchdowns and interception, plus 114 yards on the ground. Now, look, he's not a polished quarterback, throwing the football by any means, but this is a guy, he's a leader, he's a winner. He knows how to lead his team back from deficits. We saw that last year with Alabama, leading them back to beat Georgia. He's a kid that, he's mature beyond his years. And he's a guy who absolutely played really well. Same, in that game defensively, you saw OU really, I think Baylor had 69 yards, I want to say 67, 69, something like that in the second half. But, Ronnie Perkins, he's only a sophomore, but remember that name, that defensive end, had 3 sacks, four tackles for loss. Kenneth Murray had a couple of tackles for loss as well at the linebacker position. OU really stepped up. It's Charleston Rambo, another name to remember for next year. With the depth at the wide receiver position, he's a redshirt sophomore, could come out this year. I just don't expect that to happen. And a heartbreaking loss for Matt Rule and Baylor. Really have to respect what Matt Rule's been doing there. Charlie Brewer, a quarterback to watch next year, 18-29, 194 yards, 2 touchdowns and interception, 17 carries for 65 yards and 2 touchdowns. Favorite target, Denzel Mims, a guy who has a chance to be a day 2 pick. 6 receptions, 92 yards, 2 touchdowns on the afternoon. And, when you look at what they did defensively, Brevion Roy, they had a total of 4 sacks. Brevion Roy, who we talked about last week at defensive tackle position, 8 tackles and a sack from the nose tackle. So when you start thinking about some of these things, when you look at this, it was still an impressive performance by Baylor, but unfortunately, they did go down to OU. Unfortunate if you're a Baylor Bear fan, I should correct myself. If you're an OU fan, then absolutely you're ecstatic with that win. So, when we look at these, Minnesota going down to Iowa 23-19, that was certainly a a shocker of sorts, but it was a trap game, I think, for Minnesota going into Kinnick Stadium. Tanner Morgan, he's only a redshirt sophomore, 368 yards, threw for another touchdown, but they couldn't get enough really going on the ground. Rodney Smith, just 14 carries for 46 yards, did score a touchdown, but Tyler Johnson, the back half of the season, getting into Big Ten play, Tyler Johnson's really been stepping up. 9 catches, 170 yards, and a touchdown in that game. I think he's one of those guys that is going to be right there when you're talking about potential. Who are the guys that could sneak into round number 1? Definitely a day 2 pick, if nothing else. And then for Iowa, they welcomed Christian Welch back, the linebacker. He had 11 tackles and a sack in that game. But look, it was really the coming out party of A.J. Epenesa, the defensive end, 6'6", 280 pounds, 4 tackles in the game, 2.5 sacks, got another quarterback hurry. Why are we talking about A.J. Epenesa right now? Well, it's kind of a segue of sorts, because last week we talked about defensive tackles, and that's really what we've been doing over the last few weeks here with the podcast, is we've been talking about the different positions and how they've been taking shape for the draft. And AJ Epenesa has been one of the top defensive ends throughout the season, and so we're going to break down defensive ends. Like I said last week, we talked about defensive tackles. We looked at the interior of the line. We're going to go ahead and bounce to the outside. Previous podcasts, we talked about the offense. The offense is done for right now. We're going to go ahead and circle back to the offense here as the season wraps up. But we're spending time with the defense right now. We're going to be talking about defensive ends. Next week, we'll talk about linebackers. So when we talk linebackers, we're talking both the traditional sense in a 43, but also those 3-4 outside linebackers, the guys that are going to be the edge rushers in an odd man front. So guys like Kalavan Chason, Julian Okwara, Anthony Jennings, Terrell Lewis, Jonathan Greenard, Darrell Taylor of Tennessee, Zach Bond, Carter Coughlin, and a couple of group of 5 guys to keep an eye out for. Alex Highsmith of Charlotte, Ladarius Hamilton of North Texas, and then the name that's really emerging as a guy who's going to be someone who's going to come off the board in the first 3 rounds. And that's Hamilcar Rashed, 14 sacks, 22 and a half tackles for loss, And, if he decides to come out, he'll be someone who I think, because of all the production this year, he's still raw coming off the edge, but a guy who I think, because of that potential coming off the edge, you're going to see him be a day 2 pick, again, if he does decide to come out. But edge rushers at the defensive end position, we're not just talking about Chase Young or AJ Epenesa. There are a lot of guys in this draft, a lot of guys to keep an eye on. We're going to draw some comparisons. We're going to take a look at some guys, some names that I think people are familiar with as edge rushers. Who's really stepped up this year? Who are guys that have kind of struggled from a production standpoint? And we're going to talk a lot about production versus potential. And that was one of the things I talked about last year with Rashawn Gary. Rashawn Gary has all of this athletic ability and all of this talent, but can he put it together? And that was really the biggest thing, because from a production standpoint, the production just was not there for Rashawn Gary as a junior. Really, you were expecting him to step up and be the guy, be the one who's going to produce and just be that freak up front. Still ended up going, number 12 overall to the Packers, but just somebody who you were expecting a little bit more from. So far this year, has 12 combined tackles and a sack on the season there for the Packers. But at Michigan, coming off of a sophomore season, 11 tackles for loss, 5.5 sacks. You're expecting him to really emerge as a junior, wind up with just 6.5 tackles for loss, 3.5 sacks, and he beat his guy one-on-one, but he just didn't always seem to get home. And that was really the big concern is this big freakish athlete, a guy who's 6'5", 281 pounds and just running explosive times in the 40, is he somebody who's going to be able to be a disruptor at the next level. And still that, the jury's out on that. Hasn't really seen the field a whole lot there for the Packers. So we'll see what happens. One guy who I think it's safe to say is going to be a menace at the next level, a guy who I think is, should be in consideration for the Heisman Trophy, and a guy who is just a game wrecker, and that's Chase Young out of Ohio State, a guy who could be better than the Bosa brothers, both Joey and Nick, taken in the top 3 of the draft. I think Chase Young isn't getting out of the number 3 overall pick. I look back at 2017, Myles Garrett, was the number 1 overall pick in that draft. So you look at you talk about Myles Garrett in 3 seasons there at Texas A&M, 47 tackles for loss, 31 sacks. In his career, 5 pass breakups, 7 forced fumbles. So you talk about him. Then you look at Joey Bosa, and Joey Bosa with his hands. I think that's one of the things that you definitely saw. Myles Garrett, it was the explosion. Bosa with the hands, violent, a guy who can be disruptive. 3rd overall pick in 2016. Bosa finished with 51 tackles for loss, 26 sacks, 6 pass breakups, 5 forced fumbles. Then his little brother Nick Bosa. Obviously, we know he had the core injury that really eliminated his junior season after 3 games. Still ended up with 29 tackles for loss, 17.5 sacks, a couple of pass breakups, and 2 forced fumbles. Now you look at Chase Young. So here's the thing. Why are we talking about all of these numbers? Well, Chase Young in his 3 seasons, 35 tackles for loss, 27.5 sacks, 6 pass breakups, 7 forced fumbles. What has he done so far this year in 8 games? Well, he's been a game wrecker. 15.5 tackles for loss, 13.5 sacks, a pass breakup, 5 forced fumbles. So when you're talking about that, he's had at least 1 tackle for loss in every game, 3 games with multi-tackle for loss games. You look at it, 12 solo sacks, 3 assisted sacks, 95 total sack yards, which is 2nd in the FBS, 1.89 sacks per game, which is 1st in all of FBS, and 2nd place is at 1.4, and his 1.9 tackles for loss per game is 2nd only to Rashed. But when you look at Chase Young, he's so physical. He's so big. I mean, he's chiseled. He's the guy that walks off the bus, and the guy that you want to have leading your team out onto the football field. But the power, you see just how explosive he is coming off the ball. The speed to power is evident. A guy who just is able to drive his man into the backfield. And then just the athleticism and the explosion. So quick off the ball, very fluid hips, the ankle flexion. You see him, the ability to turn the corner in a hurry and really just explode into the backfield, flattens out, gets to the quarterback in a hurry. And again, with those 7 forced fumbles, he knows what to do when he gets to the football. When he arrives, he's coming with bad intentions. Now, yes, he was suspended for 2 games for the loan that he took out from a family friend that he paid back. By the way. And so you look at Chase Young, that's not going to affect his draft stock at all. I look at Chase, and especially now that Tua's hip injury, you could be talking about Chase Young battling out potentially Joe Burrow, Justin Herbert for the number 1 overall pick. Chase Young is absolutely that disruptor, a guy on the inside, just so explosive. The speed to power, he's going to bull rush you. He's going to beat you off the edge. He's also very quick to the inside. So if you overset on him, expecting a speed rush, he is going to beat you to the inside. He's going to take a couple of steps to the outside, quick arm over to the inside, and he's by you, and he's getting to the quarterback. Very, very disruptive. You have to know where he is on the field at all times. AJ Epenesa. Is he the number 2 defensive end? Well, it absolutely looked like it after last season. That's really where he set the tone. A 5-star recruit, 6'6", 280 pounds. As a sophomore, 16.5 tackles for loss, 10.5 sacks, 3 pass breakups, 4 forced fumbles, had a fumble return for a touchdown as well. And that was as a backup. He was a number 3 defensive end there for the Hawkeyes. He was playing behind Anthony Nelson and Parker Hesse. And this year he ultimately gets the starting nod, playing opposite Chauncey Golston, Cedric Lattimore, Brady Rafe there in that defensive tackle. And, teams are kind of keying in on AJ Epenesa. He hasn't had quite the production this year. 7 sacks, though, 3 pass breakups, 2 forced fumbles, and it looks like he may be getting into a groove. I said, he was struggling to start out the year, 3 sacks through 7 games, but in the last 3 games, 4 tackles for loss. Those are the four sacks and 2 forced fumbles, including the 2.5 sacks there against the Golden Gophers. But a season prior, you're looking at 9 games with a sack. Coming off the bench, 11 games with at least a tackle for loss, including 8 games in a row with a tackle for loss. And I think when you watch AJ Epenesa, he's not the explosive pass rusher that Chase Young is. He's just not. But what he does have is a lot of power in his hands. You see him explode off the football, and the hands get right into the body of the offensive tackle, and that the powerful punch really kind of takes that offensive tackle, gets him off balance, and then he's able to use either a quick club and rip, or to get the hands off of him, uses his hands to slap the tackle's hands off of him, and then he turns the corner. I think there's a little bit of stiffness in his hips, but he has excellent length, and a guy who can absolutely come off the edge and be ferocious. 29 tackles for loss, 22 sacks, 7 pass breakups, 7 forced fumbles in his career with the Hawkeyes. And from a production standpoint, there has been a drop off. You have to wonder, why that is. His first year as a full-time starter, and teams keying in on him a little bit. But even when he's one-on-one against the offensive tackles, not always able to get off blocks. And I think some of that too with some of the stiffness bending off the edge. But he has the size. I think he's scheme versatile. I watch him play, and you kind of think J.J. Watt a little bit. So I think if teams sleep on AJ Epenesa, they may be regretting it down the road, because he can be a game wrecker coming off the edge. So who's the number 3 defensive end? We've been talking so much about Chase Young and AJ Epenesa. Who's next? And I think there are a couple of guys on the list. Yetur Gross-Matos of Penn State, 6'5", 264-pound junior. Excellent length. I think that's one of the things that you really see that stands out if you watch him there at Penn State. But I'm going with Curtis Weaver out of Boise State, 6'3", 265-pound junior. All you see out of this guy is production. And I'm going to give you a name that I compare him to a little bit. And it was the 14th overall pick of the 2017 draft. And that's Derek Barnett. And what's interesting is you look at the two of them, both 6'3". Derek Barnett weighed in at 259 at the combine. Curtis Weaver's right around 265, so pretty close there. And then the production. Obviously Derek Barnett, 198 tackles. He's got about 80 on Curtis Weaver, who only has 118. But when you look at making plays behind the line of scrimmage in the backfield, Derek Barnett, 52 tackles for loss, 32 sacks, 6 pass breakups. Then we look at Curtis Weaver, 44.5 tackles for loss, 33 sacks, 6 pass breakups, 3 forced fumbles. When you look at that, the body type, the explosiveness, the nonstop motor, those are things that I think you can really draw some parallels. And what's interesting, I went back and actually went to the archives on the Ready for the Draft website, readyforthedraft.com. If you go to the site and you go to the archive, you go under 2017 draft, and I actually have Barnett going number 9 overall to the Cincinnati Bengals. But when you read about Barnett, I write that Barnett surpassed Reggie White as Tennessee's all-time leading sack artist with 33 sacks in his 3 seasons. Tireless worker, good first-step quickness, powerful hands, and good closing speed. Excellent job timing jumps to beat his man off the ball. Plays with great leverage, staying low off the ball, dipping his inside shoulder to get to the corner. Uses his hands to quickly club the offensive tackle's hands aside, then ripping through to get by. Does a really good job attacking the tackle's outside shoulder and gets his hips around quickly to get to the edge. Once he's free from the blockers, has a closing burst to get to the quarterback in a hurry. Relentless in his pursuit of the football, never gives up on a play. And I think when you look at that, when you talk about Curtis Weaver getting after the quarterback, I think the parallels are absolutely there. One of the things that we don't see quite as much with Curtis Weaver is making some plays behind the line of scrimmage and setting the edge. I think that's the difference between Weaver and Barnett. Barnett, I mentioned not only the 33 sacks, but 52 tackles for loss. So, he made 19 plays against the run behind the line of scrimmage versus Curtis Weaver with just 11 and a half. So a little bit of a difference there when you're talking about that. I thought that Barnett really stout against a run at the point of attack and set the edge. That's one of the things that you want to see Curtis Weaver do a little bit more of. But he's someone, again, it's really explosive. And the tackles for loss this season, it's the most that he's had, 16 and a half tackles for loss, and 1.7 per game, which ranks him in a tie for 6th in the FBS. And then his 1.25 sacks per game ranks him 3rd in the FBS behind Chase Young and Mr. Hamilcar Rashed. So Curtis Weaver, to me, I think is probably going to be a mid-first rounder. Derek Barnett came off the board number 14 overall. I think Curtis Weaver is probably going to be in the 15 to 20 range, probably somewhere around there would be my guess. But definitely a guy who I think is not getting out of the first round. Some people don't have him in round number 1, and I think as we see everyone go through the pre-draft process, people are going to fall in love with Curtis Weaver. Now, getting back to the Nittany Lion, Yetur Gross-Matos, really a breakout season in 2018. 54 tackles, 20 tackles for loss, 8 sacks, a couple of forced fumbles and a fumble recovery. You see his ability to really explode off the football, uses his length to his advantage, keeping the offensive tackle off of him, and uses his hands to ensure that he gets sufficient clearance off of the tackle before he starts attacking the quarterback. This year, 10 tackles for loss, 6 sacks. In his career, 32 tackles for loss, 15 and a half sacks. And when you look at it, the tackles for loss a season ago absolutely jump out to you, and you're really hoping, and what I was hoping for at least, was to see more of an ability to get to the quarterback, to get home and make plays. Is he going to be an edge rusher? Is he going to be a guy who's going to set the edge? I think he does a little bit of both. But in terms of draft stock, I don't see him. He'll probably be a guy who's coming off the board in the back half of round number 1. But I think he is a first round pick. I think you see enough explosion coming off the football. You see 6 multi tackle for loss games in his sophomore season. Just 4 tackles for loss, including 2 sacks against Iowa, with 9 tackles, 10 tackles against Indiana with a couple of tackles for loss and a couple of sacks. So he's one of those guys who, when he really gets a chance coming off the edge and firing off the edge, he can take over a game himself. One of the things that I'm a little disappointed with is just the fact that he hasn't been as productive this year as he has a season ago. And he's playing on a line with the likes of Shaka Toney coming off the edge and Robert Windsor to the inside. Kevin Givens isn't on the line this year, but was really expecting to see a lot more. He is getting some one-on-one matchups, and he's one of those guys. Is he ever going to be a double-digit sack guy at the next level? I don't know that that's really in his makeup, but he's one of those guys who is going to make plays. He's going to live in opposing backfields and he's going to make plays. And there's a guy, there's definitely a home for that type of person, that type of player at the next level. I just don't see that person coming off the board likely in the top 15, top 20 picks. So I think when you're talking about pass rushers in this year's draft, I think those, at least at the defensive end position, those would have to be the top 4 guys, right? After that, you have to kind of weigh some of the pros and the cons, and really what are you looking for in a defensive end. There's Alton Robinson out of Syracuse. He's 6'4", 260 pounds. The senior really had a breakout 2018 in his second season there with the Orange. 17 tackles for loss, 10 sacks, really explosive coming off the edge. I think that's one of the things that I definitely remember in 2018. You just saw the explosion, lining up in a sprinter stance, coming off the edge, and a guy who can rush the passer both as a stand-up end and with his hand in the dirt as well. Had 3 multi-sack games in 2018, including a sack in 3 of his final 4 games. So I think everyone was really expecting him to take off this year. He and Kendall Coleman playing, opposite him. And so far on the year, just 7 tackles for loss, 3 sacks. Does have 3 pass breakups to his name. So, 30 tackles for loss, 18 sacks in his career in just 3 seasons there with Syracuse. But, it's one of those things, the production, the steep drop off, teams really paying attention to him a lot more. And, Kendall Coleman opposite him, you're really expecting these 2 guys to kind of, take Syracuse to the next level. And, that just hasn't happened for Dino Babers. And, Kendall Coleman, also a senior opposite him, 9 tackles for loss and 4 sacks on the year, 25 tackles for loss, 15.5 sacks. In 2018, 12 tackles for loss, 10 sacks. So there's a significant drop off there in production for both of these defensive ends. And Syracuse is struggling, because of that. That's one of the things that the defense just absolutely needed, was getting more pressure on the passer. And that's something that, really when you look at their record overall, in 2018, they had just 3 losses. So they won their first 4 games, lost a couple, won 4 more, and lost to Notre Dame before winning against West Virginia in the bowl game. So you go 9-3. That's definitely respectable. This year's, though, you look at it and, they've won just 4 games. And, a lot of it comes down to offensively that they're struggling a little bit. And defensively, they're not really getting the pressure on the quarterback to be as disruptive and make plays on the defensive side of the football. So that's one of the things. Is it indicative of Alton Robinson, the NFL prospect? It's hard to say, really, but that's one of the things that is going to be cause for concern, is that significant drop off, and really the drop off overall for Syracuse as a program as a whole. One guy who hasn't had any concerns with production is Bradlee Anae out of Utah, 6'3", 265 pounds. And so far this year has 10 sacks, 11 total tackles for loss. This is a big, physical guy, someone who you'll see him stand up and rush the passer as well for the Utes, but has good power in his hands. I think he bends pretty well, can run the arc, uses the hands. I think that's one of the things that I think of when I think of Bradlee Anae, is just the physicality. He and Leki Fotu, that entire offensive line, they just look to maul you. They look to beat you up whenever possible. And he's just so physical at the point of attack. I think that's one of the things that makes him so fun to watch. But 30 tackles, let's see. Looking at my numbers. Let's see. Yeah, 37 tackles for loss, 26.5 sacks, 3 pass breakups, and 5 forced fumbles, 26.5 sacks. That's the active leader among all Pac-12 performers. And I believe in the FBS, The only guy that has more than his 26.5 is Curtis Weaver with his 33. I'm sorry, there's Curtis Weaver, Chase Young, and then Bradlee Anae. So he's in pretty good company. He's going to be somebody that people are going to look at and say, well, is Bradlee Anae a day 2 pick? So when I look at him, let's compare him maybe to Nate Orchard, another Utah Ute, came out in the 2015 draft, was a second round pick, 51st overall of the Cleveland Browns, 6'4", 255. So similar, in terms of their size, and really in 2 seasons, you saw Nate Orchard, his senior year, really exploded. 21 tackles for loss, 18.5 sacks. To his credit, so obviously, one of the things though that I am so impressed with Bradlee Anae though is for the last 3 seasons he's averaged at least double-digit tackles for loss and has had at least 7 sacks. So he's somebody, I think, when you look at it, he may not have had one splash year that like Nate Orchard has, but he's somebody who's been consistently getting after the quarterback. And I think that's where you look at, what Bradlee Anae can do getting after the quarterback. He's someone who I think can get on the field early, if nothing else, as a situational pass rusher, maybe even a guy who can set the edge a little bit for you, on defense. But I think he could end up being a day 2 pick, and someone, like I said, who I think could be productive very early on. I'll give you a name that really was kind of the name that everyone was talking about at the beginning of the season, and the production's kind of tapered off, and that's Carlos Boogie Basham, Jr., the 6'5", 275-pound junior out of Wake Forest. And so far this season, 14 tackles for loss, 7.5 sacks. And you look at that, and that looks to be a solid season, right? So he had sacks in the first 3 games, including 2.5 sacks in that big win over North Carolina. Problem is, he's only had 1.5 sacks in the last 7 games. So that's one of the things that you really that is concerning when you watch him play. Tackle for loss, so in every game, 3 multi-tackle for loss games as well. He is explosive. He uses an arm over that is one of the quicker pass rush moves of the guys that are in this draft class. And if he comes out, he could end up being a day 2 pick. I think that's one of the things that you could see happening. The one question that I have when you look at Carlos Boogie Basham is he someone who could potentially come back for his senior season? I think it's entirely possible. You look at Jamie Newman as a junior quarterback and Sage Surratt as the redshirt sophomore wide receiver. If all of these guys, all of these underclassmen come back, Wake Forest and Dave Clawson could really have something going. So it'd be interesting to see what happens with Carlos Basham. But that was the name early on that everyone was talking about, really one of the more explosive pass rushers. And, he's kind of tapered off a little bit. So it'll be interesting to see if he decides that he wants to come out after this season's over. So we'll move from the ACC to the Big Ten and take a look at Kenny Willekes, 6'4", 260 pounds from Michigan State. And this was a guy, his freshman year just played in 1 game, but after that, you're looking at a defensive end, essentially 3 seasons. He's put up 209 tackles, 43 tackles for loss, 19.5 sacks, 7 pass breakups, a couple of forced fumbles. And who he reminds me of? He really reminds me of Chase Winovich because, they both play like their hair's on fire coming after the quarterback. And Chase Winovich, similar in height, 6'3", 253. And, you look at the numbers and the production, and they're very comparable. And, when Chase Winovich, let's see, as a senior, he had 15.5 tackles for loss and 5 sacks. Willekes, 20.5 tackles for loss and 8 sacks. And then the year before, Chase Winovich, 19 tackles for loss and 8.5 sacks. Willekes, 13 tackles for loss, 5.5 sacks. So you look at it from the production standpoint, both of those guys, I think it is comparable. And, those are 2 rivals. I'm sure that they're probably not thrilled or at least the Michigan and Michigan State fans probably not thrilled that I'm comparing the two, but it's something that just definitely fits. And man, I think when you look at it, you know, just someone who has been so productive for this program. And really, 9.5 tackles for loss and 6 sacks so far this year. And, Willekes was someone who, beginning of the season, was really, another one who was kind of setting the stage for a banner season. And, that's really kind of tapered off from there. In his first 3 games against Tulsa, Western Michigan, Arizona State, had 6 tackles for loss, including 3.5 sacks. But then nothing. Have 1 tackle for loss in the next, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4. In the next 5 games against Illinois and Michigan, had, let's see, 2.5 tackles for loss, 2.5 sacks. When you look at the previous season, his junior year, which was really his banner year, had a tackle for, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 games with at least 2 tackles for loss, including 4 behind the line of scrimmage against the Nebraska Cornhuskers. Had 3.5 tackles for loss and a sack against Ohio State. Let's see, just 1 double-digit. I'm sorry, not double-digit, but multi-sack game, and that came in the opener against Utah State. But a guy who just knows how to get after the quarterback, and but I worry about him getting off blocks. And that's one of the things I think for me, as he's gone up against better competition, he's really struggled to make an impact. And I think that's one of the things that you look at Michigan State and some of the productivity there for not only him, but now with Joe Bocci being out for the use of PEDs, and Antoine Simmons, Tyreek Thompson, at the linebacker position, really having to try to step up and fill that void. Raekwon Williams has been stout in the middle there, but really the defense hasn't been the issue. It's been more of the offense. But Kenny Willekes, when he was really balling out up front, that's when I think Michigan State was at their best. And now you're looking at a team that has a 5-game losing streak. And, a big part of that, when Willekes only has 2.5 sacks to his credit, I think that makes a big difference overall. So, moving from Kenny Willekes, we're going to take a look at a guy who, has been a force for the Florida Gators, but he's been bit with the injury bug this year, and I think people are forgetting about him, and they shouldn't be, and that's Jabari Zuniga, 6'4", 246 pounds, the senior, in 4 games, 5.5 tackles for loss and 3 sacks. Okay, and he still has 33 tackles for loss and 18.5 sacks to his credit, even with only playing four games this season. He's someone for me. Look, in his 4 games this year against Miami to start out the year, 3 tackles for loss, 1.5 sacks against Tennessee Martin, 1.5 sacks. LSU and Georgia just had a tackle for loss in each of those games, so still making an impact even though he was still coming back from injury. And I think the thing, when he was healthy at the beginning of the season, you saw, Jabari and Jonathan Greenard really playing off of each other, coming off the edge. He was just so explosive. I thought he timed up the snap count really well, shooting into the backfield. And he and Jonathan Greenard, if Zuniga stays healthy, you're talking about a guy who's going to have double-digit sacks, a guy who's going to have double-digit tackles for loss, and a guy who can really, just really disrupt not only the pass but the run as well. A guy who can set the edge, and it's one of those things too. When Florida, on an obvious passing downs, Jabari would even move inside to a defensive tackle position and be an interior pass rusher. So he has some of that experience as well. He's a little on the undersized side. He's 6'4", 246 pounds. So he may need to bulk up a little bit, get to about 260 to play at the next level. You just hope that that doesn't take away from some of the explosiveness. But he's a guy who lives in opposing backfields. He's a guy who can get home to the quarterback, but he's not going to be a one-trick pony. He's not going to just be a situational pass rusher. He's a guy who I think can play in the league a long time because he knows how to set the edge. He knows how to get off blocks. He knows how to stack and shed and make some plays behind the line of scrimmage. Speaking of guys who know how to make plays behind the line of scrimmage, how about Joe Gaziano out of Northwestern? 6'4", 275 pounds, and a guy that people aren't really talking about so much, but 44.5 tackles for loss, 27.5 sacks, 13 pass breakups, 8 forced fumbles, 4 fumble recoveries, and he's a guy who I think could be scheme versatile. I think he could be a 4-3 defensive end, can also play in a 34 defense as well as a 5 technique. He's got, I think, underrated. He's not the most explosive pass rusher, but I think he's underrated in terms of his burst coming off the football. I think he's got good power in his hands, excellent length for the position as well. And just relentless, just always, motor is always running. He's getting after the quarterback. You're never having to worry about whether or not he's going to take a play off. And he reminds me of Dean Lowry. He's not quite as big as Lowry. Lowry, another Northwestern Wildcat, 6'6", 290 pounds, was 137th pick of the Green Bay Packers, taken in the 4th round. But you look at the numbers are comparable. Even when you look at the tackles. I'm sorry, the total tackles. Gaziano 143, Dean Lowry 139, Lowry 31 tackles for loss and 12.5 sacks. Had 17 pass breakups, 3 forced fumbles, 2 fumble recoveries. So they're pretty comparable there. I think Joey Gaziano with the sacks has been pretty consistently getting after the quarterback and somebody who I think, when you look at him, he'll probably be a 4th round pick. And some team will be very ecstatic, very happy that they do. I think he'll be someone that could probably bulk up to 280, 290 and potentially be a 5 technique. But he's also somebody who I think could be a defensive end in a 43 defense and uses that length to his advantage coming off the edge. Marlon Davidson out of Auburn, 6'3", 278-pound senior. And here's another guy who does a great job setting the edge against the run. 25.5 tackles for loss, 13.5 sacks, 9 pass breakups. Does a great job. You watch him play, and he reads the quarterback's eyes. So when he's not actually getting home coming off the edge, he does a really good job reading the quarterback's eyes, timing his jumps to get his hand into the passing lane and knock passes down. But Marlon Davidson, to me, when I watched him go up against Andrew Thomas, the Georgia offensive tackle, he really struggled. And obviously you're going up against a guy who is arguably the number 1 offensive tackle. If he's not number 1, then he's number 2. He and Tristan Wirfs are going to kind of battle that one out. But he really struggled to get off the block. He wasn't as explosive coming off the football. He is a little stiff in his hips. He's going to use a little bit of the speed to power, uses his hands very well, does a good job with a lot of his counter moves. But Andrew Thomas never really seemed to be in distress at all. He looked to be very under control and was able to sit down, mirror him really well. And Marlon Davidson really just didn't have an answer for Andrew Thomas, and that's concerning. I think that's one of the things to where that's going to probably push him to day 3. Might end up even falling to the 5th round. But he's a veteran. He's a guy, again, he can set the edge against the run. And so I think there is value there for Marlon Davidson at the next level. I just don't know about what his ceiling's really going to be as a pass rusher. I think he's going to be somebody who's going to come in and really be a guy who's going to be a situational player making plays around the line of scrimmage. Let's talk about a junior in this class. James Lynch, 6'4", 290-pound junior out of Baylor. Now, James Lynch this year has 12.5 tackles for loss, 8.5 sacks, and you see, a surprising burst for a guy that size, 6'4", 290, and he explodes out of his stance, uses his hands really well. I think that's one of the things that a lot of these guys, the hand usage is spot on. But with Lynch, it's so deceptive. You watch him play, and you're not expecting him to really beat guys coming off the edge with the speed, just because he is as big as he is at 290 pounds. But he's in there beating guys off the football. He's timing the snap counts, and he's making plays, shooting gaps, and making plays behind the line of scrimmage. I think that's one of the things that definitely stands out. And the hands. I talk about that. The power, and he's someone not only with the hands, but just this overall speed to power, driving guys. The bull rush, able to he has a really good long arm. He'll sit there and just take his arm and extend it into the pad level, or into the shoulder pad of the offensive tackle, drive him back into the quarterback, and he can make some plays against the run as well. 26 tackles for loss, 15 sacks in his career. Is he somebody who's going to come out in this year's draft? I don't know that he will. But when I watch him play and I look at his body type, he reminds me a lot of Justin Smith, who was a number 4 overall pick of the 49ers back in the 2001 draft. And Smith, 6'4", 285 pounds, in his final year there with the Missouri Tigers, had 11 sacks, 24 tackles for loss, 97 total tackles. Is James Lynch going to put up that type of production? No, frankly, he's not. But the explosion for a guy that size, a guy who's going to keep working to the quarterback, someone who knows what to do. He has 4 pass breakups as well. So it's one of those things that I think the comparison, that's just somebody who reminds me of him. And Justin Smith had a very long career at the next level, and somebody who I thought continued to progress and continued to get after the quarterback. I look at James Lynch. I think he's one of those guys who can be that exact same player, be a 5 technique, and have a long career in the NFL. But I'd love to see him come back, play one more year, and solidify himself as a first rounder. I was talking about hands, and I just remembered a note that I had here against Minnesota. AJ Epenesa going up against Sam Schluter, the left tackle. What I'm talking about when we're talking about the hands is he actually extended his left arm into the pad level, really on a bull rush, and then kind of got it underneath the armpit and just jacked Schluter back. Just basically picked him up and just kind of tossed him, and able to really collapse the pocket. The quarterback ultimately had to escape, and Tanner Morgan ultimately ran into Brady Reef, the defensive tackle, who ended up getting that sack. But Epenesa, the hands, the power, James Lynch, absolutely the same way. Carter Coughlin out of Minnesota, another guy who's going to, he's not going to wow you with a lot of the athleticism, I would say, but somebody who has violent hands, and that's really what I look at there with Carter Coughlin. He bends pretty well for a guy. He's 6'4", 245 pounds, 39 tackles for loss, 22 and a half sacks, 7 forced fumbles, knows what to do when he gets home, and back-to-back double-digit tackles for loss in his sophomore and junior seasons, and and 16 sacks in those 2 years as well. Hasn't been asked really to be the guy. We've kind of spread around some of the plays behind the line of scrimmage. You see Kamal Martin making a lot of plays. You see Thomas Barber at the linebacker position. You see Sam Renner at defensive tackle. Antoine Winfield making plays all over the field. So Carter Coughlin isn't at it alone. And so I think taking some of that pressure off of him. I look at Carter Coughlin. Blake Cashman ended up showing up really well at the combine. I expect Carter Coughlin to show up pretty well as well. I think there is a little bit of stiffness in his hips, but if he can show out like Blake Cashman did. Blake Cashman's actually having a really great year for the Jets this year, and I think Carter Coughlin, at least if nothing else, can be a situational pass rusher. I think he can end up being a little scheme versatile as well, maybe play in space. Although I don't know that he'd be able to drop into coverage, but allow him to put his hand in the dirt, get after the quarterback, and I think he's got some potential. Let's see. Who else can we talk about here? I'll give you a couple of group of 5 guys, and then we'll talk about a couple of FCS pass rushers before we go ahead and call it a podcast. But Trevis Gibson out of Tulsa, 6'4", 268 pounds. The senior in his last 2 years with the Golden Hurricane, 83 total tackles. But 20 and a half tackles for loss, including 11 and a half this year, and 11 sacks, including 7 so far this year. And he's had 7 forced fumbles during that time as well. Had 5 as a junior. And Delonte Scott out of SMU, 6'5", 250, and let's see. 30 tackles for loss in his career, 30 and a half tackles for loss, with 14 and a half sacks, including, let's see, in the last 2 seasons alone, 23 tackles for loss, including 12 and a half so far this year, and then 11 sacks, 6 and a half to his credit. So, really 2 guys who are coming on and emerging as playmakers down the stretch. If you want to look for another group of 5 guy, how about Brendan Hayes out of UCF? Could potentially be a 5 technique, 6'3", 293 pounds, 21 and a half tackles for loss, 10 sacks, double-digit tackles for loss as a junior, and then as a senior, 9 tackles for loss, 6 and a half sacks. He's a big guy. Uses his hands really well, pretty powerful at the point of attack, does a decent job setting the edge against the run as well. Those are 3 names to just be mindful of. They're going to be day 3 guys if they get drafted, but just guys to keep an eye on as we go through the All-Star process. I'd love to see them at least, if nothing else, get to the East-West Shrine game and see what they can do there. So I promised 3 names at the FCS level, and I'm going to go ahead and give them to you. One guy that I got to watch play is Nick Wheeler out of Colgate, 6'2", 255 pounds, 18 and a half tackles for loss, 9 and a half sacks on the year. And he's somebody who I think is so explosive coming off the football, uses his hands really well. There's that word again, the hands, but it's absolutely true. I think he uses his arm over really well, slap and rip, a really good repertoire of pass rush moves, a little undersized. Again, it's 6'2", 255, but a guy who knows how to get after the quarterback, and I'd love to see him get a shot. Another guy, Bryce Stark, out of Montana State, 6'5", 261 pounds, and 11 sacks so far this year. Had 17 tackles for loss, 8.5 sacks to go along with 61 tackles in his first season there with the Bobcats. And then Justice Reed out of Youngstown State, 6'3", 270 pounds. And so far this year, 15 tackles for loss, 10.5 sacks. Those are 3 guys who really have done a tremendous job getting after the quarterback. I see them as guys who could be edge rushers at the defensive end position. And, I'm hoping they get a shot. I don't know if any of them are going to get drafted. I think they'd be late day 3 picks. But I'd love to see them get invited to some of the all-star games and then see what they can do. See if they can make some plays behind the line of scrimmage against, some tougher competition. And who knows? Let's see what happens with some of the workouts. But I think those are guys who are adept at getting after the quarterback, and you can never have enough guys who can rush the quarterback. So that's why I think these are 3 guys. If I'm looking at FCS prospects at the defensive end position, I want to see who can get after the quarterback, who can make plays behind the line of scrimmage, and these are 3 guys that. I got to watch Wheeler. I got to watch Reed. I haven't gotten to watch Sturk play yet this year, but I'm going to make sure that I do so. And when I do, I'll make sure to talk about him in that podcast. So that's the defensive end position. Again, I mentioned that we were talking about the pass rushers at the linebacker position. We'll also talk about the traditional linebackers. So we'll talk about the likes of Isaiah Simmons. We'll talk about where Dylan Moses fits in, even though he was out for the season. Should he come out and where would he come off the board? Monty Rice, David Woodward. Where does Kenneth Murray fit into all of this? And then a name that nobody's really mentioning. How about Jordan Brooks out of Texas Tech? All he's doing is making plays behind the line of scrimmage, leading the country in tackles for loss. And then Evan Weaver out of Cal. Another guy, had over 150 tackles a season ago. Maybe not the most athletic guy, but a guy who has incredible instincts. We'll be talking about him as well. So, what are we looking forward to week 13? What games am I going to be taking a look at? I think it has to start with Penn State, Ohio State at the Horseshoe. Number 2 ranked Buckeyes taking on the number 8 Nittany Lions. I've got Ohio State in this game. Chase Young's going to be back and making some plays behind the line of scrimmage. There's just so much talent on that team. You got J.K. Dobbins and Justin Fields, who's going to be a pro prospect in next year's draft. K.J. Hill and Austin Mack at the receiver position. Benjamin Victor as well. And then when you're looking at the defensive line, not only do you have Chase Young, but I think Robert Landers is going to get a look there at the defensive tackle position. How about Malik Harrison at the linebacker position? And then, of course, you've got Jeffrey Okudah, who's going to be the number 1 corner taken in the draft. You have Sean Wade, who is a potential first-round pick. Jordan Fuller, an experienced safety as well. Those will be some names to watch out for. I mentioned with Penn State, you got Yetur Gross-Matos. Can he make plays behind the line of scrimmage? He's going to have to match Chase Young with his production. Chase Young's going to be hungry, so Gross-Matos is going to have to match that. They do have Shaka Toney on the opposite side. He's only a junior, could come back. Robert Windsor, we talked about him last week, making some plays in the middle there. Micah Parsons, outside linebacker for Penn State, a guy who makes plays all over the field. He's going to be a guy that we're talking about as a top 15 pick in next year's draft. So that'll be a fun matchup. Alabama without Tua, Mac Jones getting introduced to Western Carolina, so that'll be a nice tune-up game there before they have to take on the Auburn Tigers. Minnesota looking to come back. They're number 10 in the country, taking on Northwestern. Look to see how they bounce back. Let's see, Oklahoma State. I saw that Spencer Sanders is out for the year, so it's going to be the Chuba Hubbard show. Chuba, really can showcase himself. Get some votes there for the Heisman, and really improve his draft stock. As we go through some of these morning games, UVA taking on Liberty. Would have loved to been able to see Antonio Gandy Golden take on Bryce Hall. Bryce Hall obviously out for the year, but I think it'll still be a fun matchup seeing Gandy Golden go up against the Cavaliers. If you haven't gotten to see him play yet, he's a pretty special receiver. Notre Dame taking on Boston College. Steve Adazio's group, really an up and down season. Really want to see what A.J. Dillon can do against that defense, especially with Khalid Kareem, Julian Aquara, and then Aloy Gilman at the safety position. And it'll be interesting, to see what Boston College can do. I think Notre Dame's going to end up winning that game. But BC, if they can really play ball possession, let those running backs go, and really control the line of scrimmage, it'll really be interesting. I think Georgia has a test against Texas A&M. The big worry that I have there for the Aggies is I thought A&M played pretty well defensively against Alabama. But it was ultimately Kellen Mond who struggled and kind of let the team down a little bit. And Alabama ultimately was able to pull away. I could potentially see that the same thing happening there with Georgia, although Georgia hasn't had a very explosive offense. But at the same time, they've been effective and been able to punch it into the end zone when needed. Let's see. Indiana, the upstart Hoosiers taking on Michigan, number 13 ranked Wolverines. That'll be a fun game to watch, as will Texas. Sam Ehlinger against Charlie Brewer and the Baylor Bears, number 14 in the country. They're in Waco. How are they going to bounce back after the game against OU? You've got USC and UCLA, the crosstown rivalry, playing for the victory bell. USC actually ranked number 23 in the college football playoff rankings. They'll be playing at the Coliseum. Keaton Slovis, if you haven't gotten to watch him yet, the freshman, he's fun to watch. Throwing the ball to Michael Pittman Jr., who I think isn't getting out of the second round at the wide receiver position. So let's see. We continue to move along. Pitt and Virginia Tech. That'll be an interesting game. They're in the ACC. Scrolling through other games to watch. LSU taking on Arkansas. I think that'll be kind of another tune-up game there for LSU as they go into the remainder of the season. Cincinnati Bearcats. Josiah DeGuara, the tight end. I saw that he's just been invited and accepted an invite to the Senior Bowl. Michael Warren Jr., the junior running back. He's kind of I think his nickname is Truck. And he plays that way. He hits pretty hard, hits like a ton of bricks. Temple, Quincy Roche is a junior defensive end. He'd be an outside linebacker at the next level. He's kind of an undersized D end, but I think he'll be leading that Temple defense. Also has a couple of linebackers there that I think could end up having a shot at the next level in Sam Franklin and Sean Bradlee, along with a junior corner, Harrison Hand. So if nothing else, tune in. That's an American Conference game, group of 5, and a team that would be fun to watch. Oregon going on the road in Tempe, Sun Devil Stadium against Arizona State, and Justin Herbert. You want to be able to watch him play. You want to watch that offensive line. And what can Justin Herbert do, to really help Oregon's draft stock there I said draft stock, but they're actually in the college football playoff. They're number 6. They really have to win out and win convincingly. I think they still need a little bit of help there with Bama, but it's going to really depend on what Mac Jones is able to do there at Bama. Can Oregon really close the gap there? And then because you figure, you look at Georgia, you look at LSU, and a team. If those two teams both win out, you're still going to end up with a 2-loss team there in the SEC. So I think really you're looking at Oregon, you're looking at Alabama as the teams that'll be battling it out there for the 4th spot in the college football playoff, barring something crazy at the top. But I just don't see that happening. Let's see. Tennessee really playing good football down the stretch. Missouri, not so much. They're playing in Columbia. That'll be an interesting game just to kind of keep an eye on. OU, a late game against TCU, number 9. Sooners coming off of that big win, that emotional high. Are they going to be flat at home, or are they really going to take it to the Horned Frogs? Garrett Wallow playing there at linebacker. Jeff Gladney. Is Gladney going to be covering CD Lamb? That's going to be a question. Jalen Hurts. I see OU by a large margin in that game. Washington State taking on Oregon State. Look, Oregon State has a chance to make a bowl game this year. I think Jonathan Smith has done a really good job, something that people haven't really been talking about so much. Jake Luton at the quarterback position. Man, if this guy could have stayed healthy his entire career, he'd be a guy that we'd really be talking about in this year's draft class. That being said, I think he's really emerged as a top 10 quarterback for this year's draft. Isaiah Hodgins is wide out, big, tall receiver, plays with some physicality as well. He's a downfield threat, has a chance to be a day 2 guy, probably going to fall to day 3, 4th, 5th round, just because of the depth of the wide receiver class. We've already mentioned Hamilcar Rashed. Tune in to watch that game. If nothing else, he's going to have plenty of opportunities to get after Anthony Gordon there for Washington State. And then a left tackle, a guy who I think is going to get drafted. His name is Blake Brandel, 6'7", 305, I believe. I'm kind of going off the top of my head there, but a guy who moves pretty well for his size. I think he'll be a developmental prospect there, be a day 3 pick. Number 7, Utah Utes. Got to keep an eye on them, see what happens the remainder of the season. Can they win out? Taking on Arizona in Tucson. Washington, the Huskies. You're going to see Jacob Eason going against Steven Montez in Colorado in Boulder at Folsom Field. And then Boise State. And we've mentioned and talked about Curtis Weaver. He'll get to go up against Jordan Love there at Utah State. Utah State also has inside linebacker David Woodward. Is he going to come out and enter the draft? I don't know that he will, but he's a production machine, volume tackler, but he's not just that. He can make plays behind the line of scrimmage. He can blitz the quarterback. He can drop into coverage. Does a good job reading the quarterback. He's somebody who I think is really underrated, flying under radars. If he enters the draft, you're going to see a lot of people start talking about him. And then they also have Tipa Nalai, a guy who we're going to talk about next week as an edge rusher that I really see as a 34 outside linebacker. I think of a guy like Malik Reed. That was someone who was very productive in college, a guy who ultimately didn't get drafted, an undrafted free agent, and ends up going to Denver and is getting some playing time. He's 6'1", 251 pounds, had 38 tackles for loss, 22 sacks in his career, right? And so he ends up not getting drafted, and ultimately Denver picks him up. And if you bear with me here, just one moment, I'm going to go ahead and pull up what Malik Reed has been able to do. I remember I tuned in, got to watch him play. I saw him get a hand on the football, but he's played in 10 games, started 6 games. And, when we look at it, let's see, only 1 sack to his credit so far, but he's had, 5 games, with double-digit solo tackles, have forced 4 tackles against Kansas City. Let's see, a total of 3 tackles for loss, and fumble recovery against Indianapolis. So he's one of those guys who's really starting to make a name for himself there for Denver, especially now that Bradley Chubb is out for the year. But it's one of those guys who's taking advantage of some of the opportunities, really taking advantage of that. And some of the guys that we're going to talk about throughout this whole draft process, whether it's, at outside linebacker, defensive end, guys that can get after the quarterback, when you're productive, and you look at this, in his last 2 seasons with the Nevada Wolfpack, Malik Reed, 25.5 tackles for loss, 16 sacks. He was undersized, 11 forced fumbles. That's the other thing. He knew what to do, knew where the football was, knew what to do when he arrived, knew how to generate and a play on the football. He was playing defensive end, stand-up edge rusher as well for the Wolfpack, 6'1", 251. Undersized guy, but look, he was making plays. And I think that's one of the things when we look at a lot of these guys, were they productive? Were they able to get after the quarterback? Were they able to make plays behind the line of scrimmage? That's really what you ultimately want to see. And so that's what I'm looking forward to when we go through the rest of this draft process, especially when we talk about our outside linebackers next week. So we're going to go ahead and call that a podcast. I think we'll go ahead and get ready for the weekend, week 13 of the college football season. I can't believe it's almost over, which then means we're going to be talking about bowl season right around the corner. We'll get into the bowl prep. We'll talk about the first couple of weeks of bowl matchups, and then we'll have another podcast. We'll talk about the last couple of weeks of the bowl matchups as well. We'll divide it into 2 podcasts, and then we'll start getting into the pre-draft process after that. So really looking forward to the remainder of the season, and obviously when we get into bowl season, and then the all-star games, and then get into all of the pre-draft, including the combine. So that's kind of what to expect. And after the pre-draft process, we'll also be doing some mock drafts. We'll kind of throw some of that in there and really take a look at some of the teams, some of their draft needs, and we'll really kind of start exploring that, who are going to be some of the best fits there for some of the different programs. So with that said, we'll go ahead, like I said, call it a podcast. Hope everyone enjoys this weekend's college football matchups. I think we've got some really exciting matchups there, and we'll do this all again next week. So for ReadyForTheDraft.com, this has been the Ready for the Draft podcast. I am your host, Gregg Schutze. Have a great weekend, everyone. Take care, and I am out of here.